Elite Facts presents
10 things you may not know about Alcatraz.
10.
Military prisoners. During the gold rush of the 1840s, San Francisco was turned into a boom town, and at the time Alcatraz was dedicated to military use. Since this was the case, during the late 1850s, the U.S. Army began using their new fortress to incarcerate military prisoners, and during the Civil War, Alcatraz saw the likes of Union deserters and Confederate sympathizers locked up. However, the cells weren't only used for military purposes. They also held Native Americans, most notably those who had land disagreements with the federal government, as well as American soldiers who had deserted to the Filipino cause, and even Chinese civilians who had resisted the army during the Boxer Rebellion.
9.
Pelican Island. It's known that Alcatraz is somewhat of a tourist gold mine, but a lot of people aren't flocking to it for the reasons you would think. It seems people are visiting Alcatraz to get up close and personal with the hundreds of thousands of seabirds that have taken to using the rocky outcrop as a nesting ground. Fun fact of the day, Alcatraz is actually the Spanish word for pelican, and it's known that long before it was taken over by the U.S. military and turned into the prison we know now, Spanish explorers would call it La Isla de los Alcatraces, or the Island of Pelicans, aptly named due to the colonies of pelicans that lived on the rock. Today, however, you will find orange-footed guillemots and snowy egrets during your visit, which many people count as a top sighting on the island.
8.
The Birdman of Alcatraz was birdless. During his time at Leavenworth Prison in 1916, Robert Stroud, who was serving a manslaughter sentence for killing a bartender during a brawl, ended up fatally stabbing a guard. After the stabbing occurred, President Woodrow Wilson commuted Stroud's death sentence, instead sentencing him to a life of permanent solitary confinement. During this time, Stroud began to study ornithological diseases, as well as writing and illustrating 2 books. Not only that, he also took to raising canaries and other birds in his Leavenworth cell. Unfortunately, he was ordered to give up the birds in 1931, and as a result was banned from having any more avian cellmates during his 17-year stint inside Alcatraz. That said, it seems the 1962 movie Birdman of Alcatraz was largely fictitious, although Burt Lancaster did receive an Academy Award nomination for his role just weeks before Alcatraz was shut down.
7.
Native American prisoners. As we previously mentioned, Alcatraz was originally a military barracks and prison, and from 1873 onwards, it played host to numerous Native American activists and protesters who ended up incarcerated there. In 1873, 4 Modoc men were hanged, although to this day the reasoning for their execution is unknown. And in 1895, one of the largest and well-known groups of Native American prisoners, known as the 19 Hopi protesters, arrived in Alcatraz after a forced journey, which took well over a month. The protesters were imprisoned for defending their rights to practice their own language, as well as maintain their communal land and educate their children about the Hopi culture. It's said that the reasoning for educating their own children was because in government-run boarding schools, they would be beaten if they spoke it. The imprisonment on Alcatraz was initially intended as a way to get them to comply to the U.S. law, but once released, they focused on their resistance for as long as possible.
6.
Flowers of Alcatraz. As you'd expect, Alcatraz was once a barren island without any form of colorful plant life. But that soon changed, as when the prisoners and officers had little else to do, they would create gardens to play home to nature's beauty. However, the plants had to be of specific selection. They had to be able to withstand the harsh conditions of the island, and so the guards and prisoners went through the process of trial and error to see what could be grown there. During this time, the prisoners, officers, and their families created a vast landscape around the prison, which still flourishes to this day. It's nice to see so much color and nature on the island, and it still stands as surprising evidence of the nurturing side of Alcatraz, even during some of its darkest days.
5.
Prison break. For a prison that was supposedly escape-proof, it didn't stop the inmates from putting Alcatraz to the test. In total, 36 inmates managed to get far from the grounds, but out of those 36, 23 were captured, 6 ended up being shot to death, and 2 of them drowned. But what happened to the other 5? Well, those inmates simply went missing and were presumed drowned. including Frank Morris and brothers John and Clarence Anglin, who in 1962 attempted a breakout that later went on to inspire the aptly named movie Escape from Alcatraz, starring Clint Eastwood. This escape was well crafted as the trio chipped and scraped their way through the rotting concrete walls in their cells, using nothing but sharpened spoons, then left via an unused utility corridor and departed Alcatraz Island aboard an improvised inflatable raft. They even managed to create fake heads complete with locks of hair from the barber shop, which they placed in their beds to fool the guards. Although their possessions were later found floating in San Francisco Bay, their bodies were not, which leads to speculation that they may have engineered the perfect escape. To this day, there are still active warrants out for all three men.
4.
Transfer requests. It makes you wonder what kind of person would want to request a transfer to Alcatraz, but even though it was no Club Med, the tough-as-nails reputation it received was a bit of a Hollywood exaggeration. It seemed to appeal to quite a few inmates when they found out about the one-man-per-cell policy, which made them feel less vulnerable to any attacks that may happen from fellow inmates. James A. Johnstone, who was the first warden of Alcatraz, knew that the cause of most prison riots came down to the serving of poor food, so he prided himself on serving the best food possible, and even gave inmates the chance to grab as many helpings as they wanted. Furthermore, the better-behaved inmates would gain regular access to a library with over 15,000 books and 75 magazine subscriptions, as well as monthly movie viewings. It seemed most prisoners as a whole considered Alcatraz to have a lot more appeal than other federal prisons, and therefore transfers were quite regularly requested.
3.
Sink or swim. Even though we previously mentioned that a couple of getaway convicts drowned during their escape, this doesn't mean that the distance to the shore was impossible to cover. Of course, it was quite doubtful, unless fully trained, that anyone would survive the cold, swift waters of San Francisco Bay, but believe it or not, it did happen. This was proven back in 1962 when a prisoner by the name of John Paul Scott managed to grease himself head to toe with lard, squeeze out through a window, and swim to shore. The marathon swim did, however, leave him exhausted, and upon reaching the foot of the Golden Gate Bridge, he passed out and laid there unconscious and in hypothermic shock until police discovered him. Back then, it seemed like such an extreme thing to do, but today, there are hundreds of people who compete and finish the 1.5-mile swim during the annual Escape from Alcatraz Triathlon.
2.
Anger management. As likely as it seemed, due to its reputation and location, not all of the convicts housed in Alcatraz were the ones who had committed the most violent and heinous crimes. In fact, most of the inmates there were simply the ones that were most in need of an attitude adjustment. And no, we don't mean a visit from WWE superstar John Cena. The inmates that got shipped out to Alcatraz were mostly those who were incorrigible and disobedient. But when they did have the more criminal, murderous types arrive on site, it wasn't easy work. These convicts were known to bribe guards, start riots, and attempt multiple escapes in their previous lockups, and it was hoped that a trip to Alcatraz would get them to follow the rules, gain more respect, and, in the long run, stop causing trouble for fellow inmates and guards. If all went well during their time in Alcatraz, they would be returned to their original federal facilities.
1.
Al Capone and his banjo. That's right, Scarface himself, Al Capone, one of the most notorious gangsters and mob bosses, was among some of the first prisoners to ever be incarcerated in the new Alcatraz federal prison back in 1934. Capone was originally serving a tax evasion sentence in Atlanta and had a reputation for bribing the guards in order to receive preferential treatment, but that would all change when he was transferred to the island prison. The conditions of Alcatraz seemed to break Capone, and he reportedly told the warden, quote, "It looks like Alcatraz has got me licked." Capone, who was convict number 85, was clearly shook up by such a drastic change and became extremely cooperative, so much so that he gained permission to be a part of the Alcatraz prison band, the Rock Islanders, in which he played the banjo. The band had a regular Sunday slot and would play songs composed by Capone himself. One of these included a love song titled Madonna Mia. It's said that his favorite place to find inspiration for his music was in the showers, which ultimately was the same place he was attacked and stabbed by another inmate, James Lucas. Some visitors have said that Al Capone haunts the old shower room in Alcatraz and that ghostly strains of the banjo can sometimes be heard.
Don't forget to like us and subscribe for more elite facts.